Ma'am, the economy check-in is over there with the rest of the regular passengers. The voice cut through the early morning chaos of LAX Terminal 4, like a blade through silk. Zara Williams paused, her worn Converse sneakers squeaking against the polished marble floor. She adjusted the strap of her faded canvas backpack and looked up at the platinum blonde woman behind the premium services counter. The nameplate read Brittany Carlisle Supervisor, and Brittany's expression carried the kind of practiced disdain that only came from years of deciding who belonged where in the carefully constructed hierarchy of commercial aviation. Zara had been awake since 3 a.m, not because of jet lag or anxiety about the 14-hour journey to London that lay ahead, but because sleep had become a luxury she could rarely afford. The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind of clandestine meetings, encrypted video calls, and legal documents that would reshape the aviation industry forever. Today marked the culmination of the most ambitious acquisition in her company's history, and she was dressed like she was heading to a coffee shop rather than closing a $9 billion deal. That choice was entirely deliberate. Zara had learned long ago that people revealed their true character when they believed they were speaking to someone powerless, someone they could dismiss without consequence. The worn denim jacket that hung loosely on her slight frame had cost $12 at a thrift store in South Central LA, but it was worth its weight in gold for the truths it uncovered about the human condition. She pulled her boarding pass from the front pocket of her backpack, the paper slightly crumpled but clearly displaying the golden Chairman's Circle logo that marked her as one of fewer than 50 people worldwide who held Meridian Airways' highest tier of elite status. "I'm checking in for Flight 847 to London Heathrow," she said quietly, her voice carrying the subtle rasp that came from too many late nights spent reviewing acquisition documents and financial projections. Brittany didn't even glance at the boarding pass. Her pale blue eyes, enhanced by expertly applied makeup that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month, remained fixed on Zara's hoodie, taking in every detail that confirmed her initial assessment. The scuffed sneakers, the absence of designer luggage, the way Zara's natural hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than styled into something more appropriate for the premium cabin experience. "Like I said, economy check-in is that way," Brittany repeated, her voice taking on the slow, deliberate cadence of someone speaking to a child, or perhaps to someone she assumed might not understand English very well. She gestured with one perfectly manicured hand toward the serpentine lines that stretched back toward the terminal entrance where hundreds of travelers waited with the resigned patience of people who had accepted their place in the world's great sorting system. Zara remembered being 12 years old, standing in a similar line with her grandmother at this very airport. They had saved for 2 years for that trip to visit family in Atlanta, her grandmother working double shifts at the hospital laundry to afford 2 coach tickets. The gate agent had questioned their boarding passes 3 times, insisting there must be some mistake, some computer error that had allowed these 2 black females to purchase seats on an airplane. Her grandmother had smiled and said yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, until they were finally allowed to board, but Zara had seen the humiliation in her eyes, the way her shoulders had curved inward, as if trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable, less threatening to the delicate sensibilities of people who believed the sky belonged to them alone. That memory had shaped every decision Zara had made since she founded Phoenix Dynamics at 22, with nothing but a computer science degree, a revolutionary algorithm for predictive automation, and an absolute refusal to accept that the world's systems of exclusion were permanent fixtures of reality. Now, 13 years later, she controlled a technology empire that touched nearly every aspect of modern life, from the traffic lights that guided commuters through Los Angeles to the logistics networks that delivered packages to doorsteps across 6 continents. "I understand there might be some confusion," Zara said, placing her boarding pass on the marble counter, with the kind of gentle precision that came from years of dealing with people who mistook kindness for weakness. "But I'm actually booked in first-class seat 1A specifically, and I have some work I need to complete before we land in London." Brittany finally looked down at the boarding pass, and for a moment something flickered across her expression that might have been uncertainty. The Chairman's Circle logo was unmistakable, embossed with security features that made it nearly impossible to forge. But certainty returned quickly to her features, driven by a worldview that simply could not reconcile the evidence before her with the assumptions that had guided her life and career. "There's obviously been some kind of mistake," Brittany said, picking up the boarding pass and examining it as if she were looking at a particularly unconvincing counterfeit bill. "These premium reservations don't just happen by accident. How exactly did you obtain this ticket? Was it purchased with your own credit card, or did someone else handle the booking for you?" The questions hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both women understood perfectly. Zara felt the familiar weight settling on her shoulders, the invisible burden that she had carried through boardrooms and university lecture halls and charity galas, where she was inevitably the only person who looked like her. It was the weight of representing not just herself, but every person who shared her skin color, every woman who had been told she didn't belong in spaces of power and influence, every dreamer who had been dismissed before they could even speak their dreams aloud. But today was different. Today, in exactly 6 hours and 43 minutes, the pilot of Flight 847 would receive a message from air traffic control instructing him to taxi to a remote area of Heathrow Airport. Today, a convoy of black sedans would be waiting on the tarmac, filled with lawyers and executives who would address Zara as Chairwoman Williams and Ms. Williams, and never ever as ma'am, in that particular tone of condescending dismissal that Brittany Carlisle had perfected over her years of gatekeeping. Today, the carefully constructed walls that separated the worthy from the unworthy, the deserving from the desperate, would come crashing down with the force of $9 billion, and the absolute certainty that dignity was not a privilege to be granted by others, but a birthright to be claimed by anyone brave enough to demand it. "Let me call Wade over here to help sort this out," Brittany said, though her tone suggested she was calling for backup rather than assistance. She pressed a button on her headset and spoke into the tiny microphone that curved around her cheek like a piece of expensive jewelry. "Wade, to Premium Services, please. We have a situation that needs your attention." Zara watched as a tall man with sandy hair and a navy blue blazer approached the counter, his stride carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being the final word in disputes. Wade Morrison had been working at LAX for 15 years, rising through the ranks from baggage handler to shift supervisor, and he carried himself with the authority of someone who genuinely believed he was protecting the integrity of the flying experience from people who didn't understand their proper place within it. "What seems to be the problem?" Brittany Wade asked, though his eyes were already scanning Zara from head to toe, making the same calculations that had become second nature to him over the years. The calculation was simple, expensive clothes and confident posture meant VIP treatment, while worn denim and humble demeanor meant potential problems that needed to be managed quickly and quietly. "This passenger claims she has a first-class ticket," Brittany explained, holding up Zara's boarding pass as if it were evidence in a criminal trial. "But when I run her name through the system, the account shows some kind of unusual status code that I've never seen before. It might be a computer glitch, or it could be something more serious." Wade took the boarding pass and studied it with the serious expression of a detective examining a crucial piece of evidence. The Chairman's Circle designation was clearly visible along with seat assignment 1A and a confirmation number that followed all the proper formatting protocols. But like Brittany Wade found it easier to question the legitimacy of the documentation than to challenge the assumptions that had guided his understanding of the world for nearly 4 decades. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some additional identification," Wade said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that he had learned from watching police procedurals on television. First-class tickets, especially at this level of service, require verification that the person presenting them is actually authorized to use them. We've had issues in the past with people using stolen frequent flyer accounts or employee passes that weren't meant for personal use. Zara reached into her backpack and pulled out her passport, a document that had been stamped in countries across 6 continents as she had built her business empire, one partnership and acquisition at a time. The photo showed her 5 years younger, her hair shorter and her expression more serious, but the name and identifying information matched her boarding pass perfectly. Wade examined the passport with the theatrical thoroughness of a customs agent at a high-security border crossing, flipping through pages and holding it up to the light as if searching for hidden watermarks or signs of forgery. Finally, he handed it back to Zara with the reluctant admission that he could find no obvious problems with her documentation. "The passport looks legitimate," he conceded, "but that doesn't explain how someone in your situation ended up with access to our premium services. These accounts are typically reserved for our most valued corporate clients and long-term frequent travelers. Are you traveling on business, or is this more of a personal vacation?" The question was designed to probe deeper into what Wade saw as the central mystery of the situation. In his experience, people who looked like Zara and dressed like Zara simply didn't have the resources or connections necessary to access the highest levels of airline service. There had to be an explanation that would restore his understanding of how the world worked, some revelation that would put everyone back in their proper categories and allow him to proceed with confidence. "I'm traveling on business," Zara replied, her voice steady despite the growing absurdity of being interrogated for the crime of purchasing an airplane ticket while black. "I have meetings scheduled in London that require my immediate attention, which is why I chose to upgrade to first class so I could work during the flight." "What kind of business?" Brittany interjected, her suspicion evident in every syllable. "Are you traveling as someone's assistant, or is this more of a personal services arrangement? We need to understand the nature of your travel to ensure that our premium cabin maintains the appropriate atmosphere for our regular clientele." The implications embedded in Brittany's questions would have been clear to anyone listening, but she delivered them with the kind of professional smile that provided plausible deniability if challenged later. She was simply doing her job, protecting the interests of valued customers, ensuring that Meridian Airways maintained the standards that their premium passengers expected and deserved. Zara felt something cold and familiar settling in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced in countless boardrooms, where venture capitalists had questioned whether a young black woman could really be the founder and CEO of a technology company, or whether she was perhaps the assistant to the real entrepreneur who would be joining the meeting later. It was the feeling of being invisible, even while standing directly in front of people, of having her humanity and competence questioned as if they were optional accessories rather than fundamental truths. But invisibility, Zara had learned over the years, could be a powerful tool when wielded with precision and purpose. While Brittany and Wade continued to construct elaborate theories about how she might have gained unauthorized access to services above her station, Zara was mentally cataloging every word, every assumption, every casual cruelty that revealed the depth of bias embedded in the systems that governed daily life for millions of people who looked like her. "I run a technology company," Zara said simply, offering no additional details that might satisfy their curiosity or resolve their cognitive dissonance. "We develop automation solutions for large-scale logistics and transportation networks." Wade and Brittany exchanged a look that conveyed volumes about their assessment of this explanation. A technology company could mean anything from a small consulting firm operating out of someone's garage to a multinational corporation with billions in annual revenue. Given the evidence before them, they naturally assumed the former, perhaps imagining Zara as someone who built websites for local businesses or provided technical support for community organizations. "Well," Wade said with the tone of someone making a generous concession, "if your documentation checks out with corporate security, we'll certainly process your boarding pass according to our standard procedures. But I want you to understand that first class comes with certain expectations about passenger behavior and interaction with other travelers. We trust that you'll be respectful of the premium experience that our valued customers have paid to receive." The warning was delivered with a smile, but its meaning was unmistakable. Zara was being put on notice that she would be watched, evaluated, and judged according to standards that would not be applied to passengers whose appearance and demeanor aligned more closely with Wade's expectations about who belonged in the front of the airplane. "I understand completely," Zara replied, accepting her boarding pass and passport with the calm dignity that had carried her through every challenge and insult and moment of doubt that had marked her journey from a working-class neighborhood in Los Angeles to the executive suites of Silicon Valley. "I'm sure the flight will be everything I'm expecting it to be." As she walked toward the security checkpoint, Zara could hear Wade and Brittany speaking in lowered voices behind her. Their conversation undoubtedly focused on the unusual situation they had just encountered and the measures that might need to be taken to ensure that their other passengers weren't disturbed by her presence. She didn't turn around to listen more closely because she already knew exactly what they were thinking and what they would do with those thoughts once Flight 847 was airborne. And she was trapped in a metal tube at 35,000 feet with people who had decided she didn't belong there. What they didn't know was that in approximately 8 hours, she would own the metal tube, the company that operated it, and the paychecks that funded their comfortable certainty about the natural order of the world. The automatic doors of the premium terminal entrance slid open with a whispered sigh of hydraulics, and Ashton Blackwood strode through them as if he owned not just the building, but the entire concept of air travel itself. He moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never been questioned, never been doubted, never been forced to prove that he belonged in whatever space he chose to occupy at any given moment. Ashton was 42 years old and looked exactly like Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play the role of generational wealth in a Hollywood film. His platinum blonde hair was styled with the kind of casual perfection that required both expensive products and genetic advantages, and his navy cashmere coat hung on his frame with the easy grace that only came from clothing tailored by craftsmen who charged more for a single garment than most people earned in a month. Behind him, struggling with 3 pieces of Louis Vuitton luggage that probably cost more than a decent used car, came his assistant, a nervous young man named Trevor, who had graduated from an Ivy League business school with the specific goal of working for someone exactly like Ashton Blackwood. Trevor believed that proximity to wealth and power would somehow transfer those qualities to him through a process of professional osmosis, though so far his primary responsibilities involved booking restaurants, arranging travel, and absorbing the casual contempt that Ashton directed toward anyone he considered beneath his notice. Mr. Blackwood. Brittany's voice rose an octave as she spotted him approaching the premium services counter, her entire demeanor transforming with the speed and completeness of a Broadway performer stepping into character. The suspicious, hostile woman who had spent 20 minutes questioning Zara's right to exist in her presence had vanished, replaced by someone whose smile could have powered the airport's lighting system. Brittany Darling Ashton replied, though he had never actually learned her name and was simply reading it off her nameplate while maintaining the illusion of personal connection that he had mastered during his years in venture capital. "Always a pleasure to see your lovely face brightening this dreary place. I trust you have everything arranged for my journey to London. I have some extremely important meetings that simply cannot be delayed." Of course, Mr. Blackwood. Brittany gushed, her fingers flying over her keyboard with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this moment since her shift began 6 hours earlier. "Seat 1A is confirmed and ready. Your meal preferences have been noted, and I've personally spoken with the flight crew to ensure that you receive our very finest service throughout the journey." Wade appeared at the counter as if summoned by some invisible signal, his professional smile even broader than Brittany's as he positioned himself to bask in the reflected glory of serving someone who truly mattered in the complex social hierarchy that governed their workplace. "Mr. Blackwood." "What an honor to see you again," he said, extending his hand with the enthusiasm of a political candidate meeting a major donor. "I trust your trip to Tokyo was productive?" "Extraordinarily so," Ashton replied, accepting the handshake with the minimal effort required by politeness, while his attention remained focused on his phone where he was scrolling through emails that would determine the financial futures of companies and people he would never meet. Closed 3 deals and opened doors to markets that most Americans can't even pronounce. The beauty of global capitalism is that money speaks every language fluently. Brittany laughed as if this observation represented the height of wit rather than the casual arrogance of someone who had inherited his position in the world rather than earning it through any particular merit or effort. She processed his boarding documents with the kind of reverent care typically reserved for handling religious artifacts, triple-checking every detail to ensure that his experience would be seamless and perfect. "I notice we have another passenger booked in first class today," Wade mentioned casually, his tone suggesting that he was simply sharing information rather than seeking guidance about a potential problem. Someone who raised a few questions during check-in regarding the authenticity of her documentation. Ashton looked up from his phone for the first time since approaching the counter, his pale blue eyes sharpening with interest. Questions about authenticity. "What sort of questions?" "Well," Brittany said, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She presented what appeared to be a chairman's circle boarding pass, but her appearance and demeanor were somewhat inconsistent with our typical clientele at that service level. "We processed her ticket according to company policy, but we wanted to alert you to the situation in case it affects your comfort during the flight." The coded language was as elegant as it was transparent. Everyone understood exactly what inconsistent with our typical clientele meant, and everyone understood what kind of discomfort Ashton might experience from sharing the premium cabin with someone who looked like Zara. The beauty of such language was that it allowed them to express and act upon their prejudices while maintaining the fiction that their concerns were purely professional and entirely legitimate. "How inconsistent are we talking about?" Ashton asked, his voice taking on the tone of someone who was prepared to be personally offended by any disruption to his carefully ordered world. "Because I pay an extraordinary amount of money to avoid exactly the sort of unpleasantness that economy passengers seem to carry with them wherever they go. Let's just say that if you saw her in the terminal, you might assume she was looking for the departure gate for a Greyhound bus rather than a transatlantic flight," Wade replied, chuckling at his own cleverness, while completely missing the fact that he had just reduced a fellow human being to a punchline in his effort to curry favor with someone whose approval he desperately craved. Ashton's laugh was sharp and genuine, the sound of someone delighted by confirmation that his worldview was shared by people whose job it was to serve him. "Well, that's exactly why I fly first class, isn't it? To avoid the great unwashed masses and their inevitable drama. Though I have to say, I'm curious to see what kind of person manages to scam their way into 1A these days. Identity theft has become quite sophisticated. We're confident that our crew will handle the situation with appropriate discretion," Brittany assured him, her voice carrying the weight of promises made and favors understood. "Your comfort and satisfaction remain our absolute priority, and we would never allow anyone to compromise the premium experience that you've come to expect from Meridian Airways." As Ashton collected his boarding documents and prepared to proceed through security, he paused long enough to offer Brittany and Wade the kind of smile that wealthy people reserved for service workers who had exceeded their expectations. "You know, this is exactly why I've remained loyal to Meridian all these years. You understand the importance of maintaining standards of protecting the investment that premium passengers make in quality service. It's rare to find that level of commitment these days." The compliment left both Brittany and Wade glowing with satisfaction, their sense of professional validation complete. They had successfully identified a potential threat to the natural order, alerted the proper authority figure, and received confirmation that their vigilance was both necessary and appreciated. In their minds, they were the thin line standing between civilization and chaos, the guardians of a system that rewarded merit and punished presumption. What they failed to understand was that their definition of merit was based entirely on appearances, assumptions, and inherited advantages that had nothing to do with character intelligence, or the kind of genuine worth that could only be measured through actions, rather than accessories. They had looked at Zara Williams and seen a threat to be managed, while looking at Ashton Blackwood and seeing a standard to be protected. In less than 8 hours, when Flight 847 touched down at Heathrow Airport and Zara stepped off the plane as the new owner of Meridian Airways, they would discover that their understanding of merit, worth, and power had been not just wrong, but catastrophically, career-endingly incorrect. But for now they basked in the warm glow of Ashton's approval, secure in their certainty that they were the heroes of this story, and that justice was always on the side of people who looked and sounded like the customers they preferred to serve. The Boeing 787 stretched before Zara like a gleaming metal cathedral, its first-class cabin bathed in the soft amber glow of mood lighting, designed to create an atmosphere of exclusivity and comfort. She was the first passenger to board a privilege that came with her Chairman's Circle status, though she suspected that the early boarding had been arranged more to minimize her interaction with other premium passengers than to honor her supposed VIP standing. Seat 1A was exactly where it should be positioned at the very front of the aircraft, with a window view that would showcase the curvature of the Earth once they reached cruising altitude. Zara settled into the leather seat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, pulled out her laptop and opened the encrypted files that contained the final documentation for Phoenix Dynamics' acquisition of Meridian Airways. The irony was not lost on her that she was reviewing the paperwork to purchase an airline while sitting in that same airline's most expensive seat, surrounded by crew members who had already decided she didn't deserve to be there. In less than 9 hours, every person working on this aircraft would technically be her employee, though she had no intention of revealing that information until they had completed their journey and she had gathered sufficient evidence of exactly how Meridian Airways treated passengers who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable clientele. She had barely opened her laptop when she heard the heavy footsteps approaching down the jet bridge, followed by the familiar voice of privilege encountering an unexpected obstacle. "Excuse me, but I believe there's been some mistake with the seating arrangements." Ashton Blackwood stood in the aisle beside her seat, his cashmere coat draped over one arm and his carry-on luggage positioned as if he intended to claim the space through physical occupation rather than logical discussion. His platinum blonde hair caught the cabin lighting in a way that made him look like a classical statue that had come to life and decided to express its displeasure with the modern world. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what mistake you're referring to," Zara replied without looking up from her laptop screen where she was reviewing the final financial projections that would make her the owner of approximately $4 billion worth of aircraft equipment and infrastructure. "My boarding pass shows seat 1A, which appears to be exactly where I'm sitting." "Well, that's obviously the source of the confusion," Ashton said, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a particularly slow student. "You see, I always sit in 1A on this route. It's been my seat for the past 7 years, and Meridian has always ensured that my preferences are accommodated. There must have been some computer error that double-booked the seat." Zara finally looked up from her laptop, meeting Ashton's gaze with the calm directness that had served her well in boardrooms filled with men who assumed that youth, gender, and race automatically disqualified her from serious consideration. "That's interesting, but my reservation was made 6 weeks ago and confirmed multiple times. If you have concerns about your seating assignment, I suggest you speak with the flight attendants." As if summoned by some invisible signal, a blonde flight attendant appeared in the aisle beside Ashton, her smile bright and professional as she assessed the situation. Melissa Frost was 45 years old and had been working for Meridian Airways for nearly 2 decades, during which time she had developed an intuitive understanding of passenger hierarchy that allowed her to navigate conflicts with the precision of a diplomat and the efficiency of a military strategist. "Mr. Blackwood, how wonderful to see you again," Melissa said, her voice warm with the kind of familiarity that came from years of providing exceptional service to passengers who could make or break her performance evaluations. "I trust your connection in Los Angeles went smoothly. We have your usual champagne, chilled and ready for service." "Thank you, Melissa. You're always so thoughtful," Ashton replied, his irritation softening slightly in the face of proper recognition and deference. "However, we seem to have a small problem with the seating arrangements. This passenger appears to be occupying my seat." Melissa's smile never wavered as she turned her attention to Zara, though something subtle shifted in her expression, a barely perceptible cooling that suggested she had already made her assessment of the situation and reached conclusions about how it should be resolved. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" Zara handed over the document without argument, watching as Melissa examined it with the theatrical thoroughness of someone who was hoping to find an obvious error that would allow her to resolve the conflict in favor of the passenger whose approval mattered most to her professional future. "Well, this is certainly unusual," Melissa murmured, though the boarding pass was entirely legitimate and clearly indicated Seat 1A. "Mr. Blackwood." "I'm afraid her documentation does appear to be in order, though I'm not entirely sure how this situation developed. Let me check with the captain about our options for resolving this in a way that ensures everyone's comfort." "Options?" Zara asked, her voice still calm, but with an edge that suggested she understood exactly what kind of options were being considered. "I'm not aware that properly ticketed passengers need to justify their seat assignments to other passengers or crew members." "Of course not," Melissa replied quickly, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that we occasionally encounter situations where computer errors or booking irregularities create conflicts that require creative solutions. Our priority is ensuring that all passengers have an enjoyable flight experience." Ashton stepped closer to Zara's seat. His physical presence intended to create a sense of intimidation that had probably worked for him in countless business negotiations and social situations where people had backed down rather than challenged someone who radiated wealth and entitlement. "Look, sweetheart, I don't know how you managed to get that boarding pass, but this is my seat. I fly this route every month. I spend more money with this airline than you probably make in a year, and I'm not about to let some computer glitch ruin my flight." The casual condescension in his voice, the assumption that money automatically translated to moral authority, the complete dismissal of her right to occupy space that she had legitimately purchased, all of it crystallized in Zara's mind as a perfect representation of everything she had spent her adult life working to change. She closed her laptop and stood up, her slight frame dwarfed by Ashton's height, but her presence somehow filling the space between them with an energy that made the air itself feel charged. "Mr. Blackwood." "Is it?" Zara said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the cabin where other passengers were beginning to board and take notice of the confrontation developing in the premium section. "I'm going to give you one opportunity to step back, return to whatever seat you're actually assigned, and apologize for the assumption that your perceived status gives you the right to displace other passengers." "Are you threatening me?" Ashton asked, his voice rising with genuine incredulity at the suggestion that someone like Zara might pose any kind of challenge to someone like him. "Melissa, I want this person removed from the aircraft immediately. This is exactly the kind of situation that premium passengers shouldn't have to deal with." Melissa looked between them, her professional training warring with her personal biases as she tried to calculate the safest course of action for her own interests. On one side was a valued frequent flyer who could make her life miserable with a single complaint to management. On the other side was a passenger whose documentation appeared legitimate but whose presence clearly threatened the established order that made her job predictable and manageable. "Ma'am Melissa," said, turning to Zara with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I think there might be a way to resolve this that works for everyone. We have several other excellent seats available in the forward cabin, including 4C, which offers similar amenities and service. If you wouldn't mind moving there, we could settle Mr. Blackwood in his usual spot and ensure that everyone starts their journey on a positive note." The request was phrased as a suggestion, but everyone understood it as a demand backed by the implicit threat of escalation if Zara refused to comply. She was being asked to solve a problem that she had not created, to sacrifice her rights for the comfort of someone whose only claim to priority was his assumption that the world existed to serve his preferences. "I appreciate your diplomatic approach," Zara replied, settling back into her seat and reopening her laptop with deliberate calm. "But I'm not moving. I purchased this seat, I'm entitled to this seat, and I'm going to remain in this seat for the duration of this flight. If Mr. Blackwood has concerns about his seating assignment, he's welcome to discuss them with your supervisor or take them up with Meridian's customer service department after we land." The silence that followed her declaration was profound, the kind of quiet that occurs when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, and everyone present realizes they are about to witness something that will fundamentally change the dynamics of the situation. Ashton's face flushed red with anger and disbelief, while Melissa's smile finally cracked, completely revealing the frustration and panic that had been building beneath her professional veneer. Melissa Ashton said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "Get the captain down here immediately. This passenger is being disruptive and non-compliant, and I want her removed from this aircraft before we push back from the gate." The cockpit door opened with a pneumatic hiss, and Captain Pierce Davidson emerged into the first-class cabin like a naval officer stepping onto the deck of his ship to restore order among the crew. At 52, he carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone who had spent the last 25 years making decisions that affected the lives and safety of hundreds of people at a time, and his silver hair and crisp uniform projected the kind of competence that passengers found reassuring in the moments before trusting their lives to his judgment and skill. Captain Davidson had flown for Meridian Airways since his discharge from the Air Force, rising through the ranks from first officer to captain to senior captain with a record that was genuinely exemplary when it came to safety, punctuality, and technical proficiency. What his personnel file did not document, because such things were rarely written down in official records, was his unconscious but deeply ingrained belief that some passengers naturally deserved more consideration than others, and that part of his job involved protecting the flying experience of those who had earned their place in the premium cabin through the proper channels. "What seems to be the problem here?" Captain Davidson asked, though his eyes had already completed their own assessment of the situation and reached conclusions that would have been obvious to anyone familiar with his background and worldview. He saw Ashton Blackwood, a man whose expensive clothing and confident bearing marked him as the kind of passenger that Meridian Airways existed to serve. And he saw Zara Williams, whose casual attire and calm defiance suggested someone who either didn't understand the rules that governed air travel or had chosen to ignore them entirely. "Captain, thank goodness you're here," Melissa said, her relief evident as she prepared to transfer responsibility for the situation to someone with greater authority and presumably clearer options for resolving conflicts that threatened to disrupt the carefully orchestrated experience that first-class passengers expected. "We have a seating dispute that's becoming quite disruptive. Mr. Blackwood, who's been a loyal customer for many years, arrived to find someone else in his usual seat." "His usual seat," Captain Davidson repeated, turning his attention to Ashton with the kind of respectful interest that he had learned to show toward passengers whose satisfaction could affect his career trajectory. "Mr. Blackwood, I apologize for any inconvenience. What's your normal seating preference?" "1. "A captain," Ashton replied, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose patience had been exhausted by the need to explain obvious facts to people who should have already understood them. "I've been flying this route monthly for 7 years, always in 1A, and I've never encountered anything like this situation before. I specifically chose Meridian because of your reputation for maintaining proper standards and ensuring that valued customers receive the service they deserve." Captain Davidson nodded with the understanding of someone who recognized the delicate balance between customer satisfaction and operational efficiency that governed every aspect of commercial aviation. Unhappy passengers, particularly wealthy and influential passengers, could generate complaints that rippled through corporate hierarchies and eventually reached people who had the power to affect his own professional standing and advancement opportunities. "And you, ma'am?" Captain Davidson said, turning to Zara with the polite but firm tone that he had perfected for dealing with passengers who might be confused about policies or procedures. "May I see your boarding documentation?" Zara handed over her boarding pass without comment, watching as the captain examined it with the same theatrical attention to detail that had characterized every interaction she had experienced since arriving at the airport that morning. She could see the moment when Captain Davidson registered the chairman's circle designation and the seat assignment that clearly indicated 1A, followed by the brief flicker of confusion that crossed his features as he tried to reconcile the evidence before him with his assumptions about who belonged in the premium cabin. "This appears to be legitimate," Captain Davidson admitted, though his tone suggested that appearances could be deceiving and that legitimate documentation didn't necessarily resolve the underlying issues that concerned him. "However, I'm not entirely clear on how this booking was made or under what circumstances you gained access to this level of service." The question was phrased as a request for information, but Zara understood it as an interrogation designed to uncover some explanation that would allow Captain Davidson to justify whatever decision he had already made about how this conflict should be resolved. She had seen the same process play out in boardrooms and conference rooms and investor presentations, where her presence was questioned not because she lacked qualifications or authority, but because her qualifications and authority challenged assumptions about who was allowed to possess them. "I made the reservation 6 weeks ago through Meridian's corporate booking system," Zara replied, her voice steady despite the growing absurdity of being required to justify her right to occupy a seat she had purchased. "I provided a credit card, received confirmation emails, and completed all the standard procedures that any passenger would follow when booking premium service." "Corporate booking system," Captain Davidson repeated, seizing on this detail as if it might provide the key to understanding the situation. "Are you traveling on company business, or were you perhaps booking on behalf of someone else who will be joining you later?" The implication was clear. Someone like Zara might have access to corporate travel systems in an administrative capacity, perhaps as an assistant or travel coordinator, but she couldn't possibly be the actual business traveler for whom the reservation had been made. Captain Davidson was searching for an explanation that would restore his understanding of the natural order, while allowing him to resolve the conflict in favor of the passenger whose approval mattered most to his professional interests. "I'm traveling on my own company's business," Zara said simply, offering no additional details that might satisfy Captain Davidson's curiosity or resolve his cognitive dissonance. "And I'm traveling alone, so there won't be anyone joining me later." Captain Ashton interjected, his patience finally exhausted by what he saw as an unnecessarily prolonged discussion of obvious facts. "I don't care how she obtained that boarding pass. The bottom line is that 1A is my seat. It's always been my seat, and I'm not going to accept being displaced by someone who clearly doesn't understand the expectations that come with premium service. If you can't resolve this situation immediately, I'll be forced to consider whether Meridian Airways is still worthy of my business." The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had used similar leverage successfully in countless other situations, and Captain Davidson felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Losing a valued customer like Ashton Blackwood would generate exactly the kind of negative attention from management that could affect his own standing within the company, while accommodating a passenger whose status remained somewhat mysterious would likely go unnoticed by anyone who mattered. "Ma'am," Captain Davidson said, turning back to Zara with what he imagined was a reasonable compromise position, "I'm going to have to ask you to move to another seat for operational reasons. We need to maintain the seating arrangements that our crew has prepared for, and Mr. Blackwood's long-standing travel patterns make him an integral part of our service planning for this route." The explanation was pure fiction invented in the moment to provide legal cover for a decision that was based entirely on assumptions about passenger hierarchy and the need to maintain the satisfaction of customers who looked and sounded like the people Captain Davidson was most comfortable serving. There were no operational reasons that required Ashton to sit in 1A, no service planning, that depended on specific passengers occupying specific seats, no safety or regulatory concerns that justified overriding Zara's legitimate reservation. Operational reasons. Zara repeated her voice, carrying a note of incredulity that was entirely justified given the transparent absurdity of Captain Davidson's explanation. Could you be more specific about what operational requirements dictate that one passenger must give up his assigned seat to accommodate another passenger's personal preferences? Captain Davidson's jaw tightened with irritation at being challenged by someone he had expected to defer to his authority without question. In his experience, passengers who raised objections to crew instructions were usually people who didn't understand the complex responsibilities involved in safely operating a commercial aircraft, and their resistance typically crumbled when confronted with the possibility of more serious consequences. "Ma'am, on my aircraft, the flight crew's instructions are final," Captain Davidson said, his voice rising slightly as he invoked the federal regulations that gave airline crews broad authority to maintain order and safety. "If you continue to resist our seating arrangements, I'll be forced to contact airport security and have you removed from this flight. You'll also be placed on Meridian's no-fly list, which means you won't be able to purchase tickets on this airline in the future." The threat was designed to end the discussion by raising the stakes beyond what any reasonable passenger would be willing to risk over a seating dispute. Captain Davidson had used similar ultimatums successfully many times before, and he expected Zara to recognize that continued resistance would cost her far more than simply accepting an alternative seat assignment. Instead, Zara stood up slowly, collecting her laptop and personal items with deliberate calm. For a moment, Captain Davidson thought he had achieved the result he wanted, that she was preparing to move to whatever seat Melissa would assign to her. But instead of following Melissa toward the alternative seating options, Zara stepped into the aisle and looked Captain Davidson directly in the eyes. "Captain Davidson," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the cabin where other passengers had begun to pay close attention to the confrontation unfolding in the premium section. "I want you to understand that I'm moving under protest and that I'm documenting everything that has happened here for future reference. Your threat to place me on a no-fly list for refusing to give up a legitimately purchased seat to accommodate another passenger's personal preferences will be reported to the appropriate federal authorities." "You can report whatever you like," Captain Davidson replied, though something in Zara's tone made him slightly uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite identify. "But you're going to move to the seat that my crew assigns, and you're going to do it now, or you're going to be escorted off this aircraft." Zara nodded once as if confirming something for herself, then followed Melissa toward the back of the first-class cabin where seat 8D waited for her. As she settled into the middle seat between two other passengers, she pulled out her phone and composed a brief encrypted message to an email address that Captain Davidson would have recognized if he had been paying attention to the corporate communications that had been circulating through Meridian Airways executive offices for the past several weeks. "Initiate acquisition protocol, Alpha," she typed, then hit send before turning off her phone and preparing for the longest, most uncomfortable, and most consequential flight of her life. The difference between Seat 1A and Seat 8D was measured in more than just the 20 feet of aircraft cabin that separated them. Zara found herself wedged between a businessman who had clearly decided that armrest territory was negotiable and a woman who seemed to believe that the middle seat passenger had forfeited all rights to personal space when they accepted their seating assignment. The view from her new position offered a perfect diagonal sightline to watch Ashton Blackwood settle into her original seat with the satisfied expression of someone whose sense of natural order had been properly restored. Melissa appeared almost immediately with a crystal flute of champagne, her smile warm and genuine as she leaned down to speak quietly with Ashton about his dinner preferences and whether he would like his usual selection of magazines and newspapers. The contrast with the perfunctory nod that Zara received when Melissa passed her seat was so stark that other passengers began to notice the disparity in service levels within the same cabin class. "Ma'am, would you care for a beverage?" Melissa asked when she finally reached Zara's row, her voice carrying the mechanical politeness of someone fulfilling a minimum obligation rather than providing genuine hospitality. The question came nearly 20 minutes after she had served champagne to every other passenger in the forward cabin, a delay that was clearly intentional but subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability. "I'll have champagne, please," Zara replied, watching as Melissa's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "The same Dom Perignon that you served to the other first-class passengers." Of course, Melissa said, though she made no immediate move toward the galley where the champagne was chilled and waiting. "I'll be right back with that." 15 minutes passed before Melissa returned with a plastic cup filled with what appeared to be the kind of sparkling wine typically served in economy class, the cheap alternative that airlines use to reduce costs while maintaining the illusion of premium service. She placed it on Zara's tray table without comment, as if the substitution was so obvious that it required no explanation or acknowledgement. "This isn't Dom Perignon," Zara observed quietly, holding up the plastic cup to examine its contents. "This appears to be the sparkling wine from your economy service." "I apologize for the confusion," Melissa replied, though her tone suggested anything but apology. "But we've run short on the premium champagne due to higher-than-expected demand from our valued frequent flyers. I'm sure you understand that our regular customers take priority when it comes to limited amenities." The explanation was delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that made it difficult to challenge without appearing unreasonable. But Zara had watched Melissa serve Dom Perignon to at least 6 other passengers since being forced to change seats. She had also noticed that the flight was only half full, which made claims of higher-than-expected demand particularly creative exercises in customer service fiction. "I see," Zara said, accepting the plastic cup with the same calm dignity that had carried her through every other humiliation of the day. "Thank you for accommodating me with whatever was available." As the flight progressed, the pattern of differential treatment became increasingly obvious to anyone paying attention to the interactions between crew and passengers. When meal service began, Ashton received a detailed explanation of each course from a chef who had been specially trained to present the airline's premium dining experience with appropriate theater and expertise. His dinner was served on bone china, with silver cutlery accompanied by wine pairings that had been selected to complement each dish and enhance the overall experience of first-class dining at 35,000 feet. When Melissa finally reached Zara's row with the meal cart nearly 30 minutes after completing service for the rest of the cabin, her explanation of the available options was perfunctory and delivered without eye contact. "We have the beef tenderloin or the salmon," she said, already reaching for one of the meals before Zara could express a preference. "I'd like the beef tenderloin, please," Zara said, watching as Melissa's hand froze over the meal containers. "Actually, we're out of the beef," Melissa replied without checking the contents of her cart where several containers of beef tenderloin were clearly visible. "The salmon is quite good, though. I'm sure you'll find it satisfactory." The salmon, when it arrived, was served on the same plastic dinnerware used in economy class with plastic cutlery and none of the presentation touches that had characterized the meals served to other first-class passengers. The portion was noticeably smaller, and the wine pairing consisted of a small bottle of white wine that Zara recognized as the cheapest option available in the airline's inventory. But the most egregious incident occurred approximately 4 hours into the flight when Zara excused herself to use the lavatory and returned to find her laptop computer powered down and her work area damp with what appeared to be spilled water. Melissa appeared almost immediately, her expression a study in concerned professionalism as she surveyed the apparent accident. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry," Melissa said, producing a handful of napkins with the efficiency of someone who had been prepared for this exact situation. "We experienced some clear air turbulence while you were away from your seat, and I'm afraid a water glass must have shifted and spilled onto your belongings." Zara looked around the cabin, noting that no other passengers appeared to have experienced any effects from the supposed turbulence that had struck only her immediate area. Her laptop, which had been functioning perfectly when she left her seat, now refused to power on, despite showing no obvious signs of water damage beyond the mysteriously damp surface of her tray table. Turbulence. Zara repeated, her voice carefully neutral as she attempted to restart her computer. I didn't feel any movement while I was in the lavatory. Turbulence can be very localized, Melissa explained with the confidence of someone citing established scientific principles rather than improvising creative explanations for deliberate sabotage. Sometimes passengers in different parts of the cabin experience it differently depending on their sensitivity to aircraft movement. The laptop remained dead despite Zara's attempts to revive it, representing not just the loss of an expensive piece of equipment, but also several hours of work that she had planned to complete during the flight. More importantly, it represented a level of vindictive cruelty that went beyond poor service and entered the realm of deliberate harassment designed to punish her for the crime of refusing to accept her assigned place in the airline's social hierarchy. I'll need you to file an incident report, Zara said, pulling out her phone to document the damage with photographs. This computer contains important business files, and I'll need documentation of the incident for insurance and replacement purposes. Of course, Melissa replied, though she made no move to retrieve the necessary paperwork or begin the process of documenting what had allegedly occurred. I'll make sure to include that in my post-flight report. These things happen sometimes, unfortunately. It's just one of the risks of air travel. As Zara photographed the damage and composed detailed notes about each incident that had occurred since boarding, she became aware that her actions were being observed by other passengers who had begun to understand that they were witnessing something more than ordinary poor service. An elderly black businessman in seat 3C had been quietly documenting the differential treatment with his own phone, while a young white woman in seat 6A had started offering quiet words of support whenever crew members were out of earshot. I saw what really happened, the woman in 6A whispered when Melissa had moved on to other duties. She poured that water deliberately while you were in the bathroom. This is absolutely disgusting behavior, and you should file a complaint with the FAA when we land. The support was both appreciated and validating, confirming that Zara's perception of systematic harassment was shared by objective observers who had no personal stake in the situation. But it also highlighted the broader implications of what was occurring, the way that bias and discrimination infected systems that were supposed to serve all passengers equally regardless of their appearance background or assumptions about their economic status. For Zara, who had spent years building a business empire based on the principle that technology could create more equitable and efficient systems for human interaction, the experience was both personally insulting and professionally instructive. She was witnessing firsthand the casual cruelty that millions of people experienced every day when they attempted to access services and opportunities that others took for granted, and she was documenting every detail for the comprehensive review that would begin the moment Flight 847 touched down at Heathrow. In her phone, she composed one final message before the captain announced their initial descent into London. Documentation complete. Recommend immediate implementation of Protocol 7 upon arrival. Full review and restructuring authorized. The message was brief, professional, and entirely devastating in its implications for every person who had participated in the systematic harassment that had characterized her journey from Los Angeles to London. In less than 2 hours, when she walked off this aircraft as the new owner of Meridian Airways, the carefully constructed hierarchy that had allowed such treatment would begin its complete and irreversible collapse. The descent into London Heathrow began with the familiar sensation of the aircraft tilting forward, and the subtle change in engine pitch that signaled the beginning of the end of Flight 847's journey across the Atlantic. Outside the small oval windows, the English countryside spread beneath them like a patchwork quilt of green fields and medieval villages, though the view was largely obscured by the heavy gray clouds that seemed to be London's permanent atmospheric accompaniment. Captain Davidson's voice crackled over the intercom with the usual announcements about local weather arrival procedures and reminders to keep seat belts fastened until the aircraft reached the gate. But as they approached the airport, something unusual began to unfold that caught the attention of experienced travelers who knew what a normal landing sequence should look like. Instead of proceeding toward Terminal 5, where Meridian Airways flights typically arrived at Heathrow, the aircraft banked sharply to the left and began heading toward a remote area of the airport that was normally reserved for cargo operations and aircraft requiring special handling. The passengers who noticed the deviation began murmuring among themselves, consulting their phones and airport maps to understand why their flight was deviating from standard arrival procedures. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Davidson with an update on our arrival." The captain's voice returned to the intercom system, though his tone had changed from the routine professionalism of his earlier announcements to something tighter and more concerned. "Air traffic control has directed us to a remote parking position for what they've described as routine customs and immigration processing. We'll be met by officials who will board the aircraft to conduct brief interviews before we're cleared to proceed to the main terminal." The explanation raised more questions than it answered, particularly for passengers familiar with international travel procedures. Customs and immigration processing normally occurred after passengers deplaned and proceeded through the terminal, not while they remained seated aboard the aircraft. The unusual nature of the announcement created a ripple of anxiety through the cabin as people began speculating about what might have prompted such extraordinary measures. Ashton Blackwood, who had been dozing in seat 1A after consuming several glasses of wine with his dinner, jerked awake at the sound of the captain's announcement. His travel experience was extensive enough to recognize that something was wrong with the arrival process, and his sense of personal importance made him automatically assume that any delays or complications were unacceptable infringements on his valuable time. "Melissa," he called out, pressing his call button with the imperious urgency of someone accustomed to having his concerns addressed immediately. "What exactly is going on here? I have a car waiting at Terminal 5 and I can't afford to be delayed by whatever bureaucratic nonsense this represents." "I'm not entirely sure, Mr. Blackwood," Melissa replied, her own confusion evident, as she tried to maintain professional composure while dealing with a situation that was clearly outside her normal experience. "The captain says it's routine, but I've never seen customs officials board an aircraft like this before. I'm sure it will be resolved quickly." From her middle seat in row 8, Zara watched the unfolding confusion with the calm detachment of someone who knew exactly what was happening and why. The customs officials who would be boarding the aircraft in approximately 15 minutes were not actually customs officials at all, but rather a carefully coordinated team of lawyers, executives, and security personnel who had been waiting for her signal to implement what Phoenix Dynamics had codenamed Protocol 7. The aircraft touched down with a gentle bump that was barely perceptible to the passengers, followed by the familiar sensation of reverse thrust and braking that brought them to a complete stop on a stretch of tarmac that seemed miles away from any visible terminal or passenger facility. Through her window, Zara could see a convoy of black sedans and SUVs approaching the aircraft, their headlights cutting through the gray afternoon drizzle that had begun to fall over London. "This is highly irregular," announced the businessman in seat 3C, whose frequent travel experience had given him strong opinions about proper arrival procedures. "I've flown this route dozens of times, and I've never seen customs officials meet a flight on the tarmac like this. Something significant must have happened to trigger this level of security response." Captain Davidson emerged from the cockpit to address the growing concerns of his passengers, his uniform crisp and his expression carefully neutral, as he prepared to manage what he clearly hoped would be a brief inconvenience before normal deplaning procedures could resume. He moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, stopping to speak personally with the passengers who he recognized as frequent flyers and valued customers. "Mr. Blackwood, I apologize for the unusual arrival procedure," Captain Davidson said, his voice carrying the deferential respect that he had learned to show toward passengers whose satisfaction could affect his career prospects. "I've been assured that this will be resolved quickly, and will have you on your way to central London within the hour." "An hour?" Ashton's voice rose with indignation that was both genuine and performative. designed to ensure that everyone within earshot understood his importance and the unacceptability of any delays to his schedule. "Captain, I have extremely important meetings that cannot be postponed. Whatever this is about, I trust that you'll make it clear to these officials that some passengers have priorities that supersede routine administrative procedures." "I'll certainly communicate your concerns," Captain Davidson assured him, though his ability to influence customs and immigration officials was exactly as limited as any airline captain's would be under such circumstances. "I'm confident that this will be resolved with minimal disruption to your schedule." The captain's assurances became increasingly hollow as the convoy of vehicles reached the aircraft and began disgorging passengers who clearly represented something far more significant than routine customs processing. Through the small windows, passengers could see men and women in expensive business attire, setting up what appeared to be a mobile command center, complete with communication equipment and official-looking documentation that suggested they were preparing for an extended operation rather than brief interviews. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Davidson announced over the intercom, his voice now carrying unmistakable signs of stress and confusion. "Please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened. Officials are boarding the aircraft now, and we ask for your patience and cooperation as they conduct their procedures." The aircraft door opened with its characteristic pneumatic hiss, followed by the sound of multiple people boarding with purpose and authority that was immediately recognizable to anyone who had experience with high-level corporate or government operations. The footsteps were confident and coordinated, suggesting a team that had planned and rehearsed their actions rather than improvised responses to an unexpected situation. From her position in the back of the first-class cabin, Zara could hear the voices of people she recognized from months of planning and preparation for this moment. James Wellington, her chief operating officer, was speaking in the low, professional tones that had made him one of the most respected executives in Silicon Valley. Dr. Sarah Chen Phoenix Dynamics' general counsel was reviewing documents with the methodical precision that had made her legendary among corporate lawyers who specialized in complex acquisitions and regulatory compliance. "Excuse me," Ashton called out toward the front of the aircraft, his voice carrying the assumption that whoever these officials were, they would naturally recognize his importance and prioritize his concerns above those of other passengers. "I'm Preston Blackwood from Blackwood Capital. I need to speak with whoever is in charge here about expediting my clearance so I can proceed to my appointments in the city." The response came not from the officials who had boarded, but from a voice that Ashton didn't recognize, but that carried unmistakable authority and calm confidence. "Mr. Blackwood, please remain in your seat. Everyone will be processed in due course, and I assure you that your concerns will be addressed appropriately." For the first time since the unusual arrival procedures had begun, Ashton found himself dealing with someone who was not deferential to his wealth and status. Someone who spoke to him with the same polite but firm tone that he was accustomed to using with people he considered beneath his notice. The experience was sufficiently novel that he actually complied with the instruction to remain seated, though his expression suggested that his patience would not last much longer. The man who stepped into view at the front of the first-class cabin commanded immediate attention through the simple authority of his presence and bearing. James Wellington was 58 years old, distinguished in the way that only came from decades of making decisions that affected billions of dollars and millions of lives, and his tailored charcoal suit suggested someone who moved comfortably through the highest levels of international business and finance. Behind him came Dr. Sarah Chen, whose reputation as one of the most formidable corporate lawyers in Silicon Valley was evident in the way she carried herself and the thick portfolio of documents that she handled with the care of someone who understood their transformative power. The third person in their group was David Rodriguez, head of security for Phoenix Dynamics, whose presence suggested that whatever was about to unfold required both legal precision and physical authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," James Wellington announced, his voice carrying easily through the cabin with the kind of trained projection that came from years of addressing corporate boards and congressional committees. I apologize for the unconventional nature of your arrival, but I assure you that this situation will be resolved efficiently and with minimal disruption to your travel plans. Melissa approached the group with the kind of nervous deference that flight attendants typically showed toward customs officials and other authority figures who had the power to complicate their professional lives. Gentlemen, ma'am, I'm Melissa Frost, lead flight attendant for this service. Is there anything my crew can do to assist with your procedures? Thank you, Ms. Frost. Wellington replied, consulting a tablet that contained detailed files on every member of the flight crew and most of the passengers. We're looking for Ms. Zara Williams. According to our records, she should be aboard this aircraft. Zara Williams. Melissa repeated her confusion genuine as she tried to connect the name with her mental roster of passengers. The name didn't match any of the frequent flyers or VIP customers that she had been briefed to provide with special attention, and she couldn't immediately recall encountering anyone by that name during the flight service. She would have been booked in first class. Dr. Chen added her voice, carrying the precision of someone accustomed to providing exactly the information necessary to achieve specific objectives. Seat 1. Specifically, though we understand there may have been some changes to the seating arrangements during boarding. The mention of Seat 1A caused a visible shift in Melissa's expression as she suddenly understood the connection between the name they were seeking and the passenger who had been forced to move from the premium seat to accommodate Ashton Blackwood's preferences. Her face flushed slightly as she realized that the officials were asking about the same passenger whose treatment had been the source of conflict and controversy throughout the flight. "Oh," Melissa said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she glanced nervously toward the back of the cabin where Zara remained seated in row 8. "You mean the passenger who claimed she had a chairman's circle reservation? She's back there." Claimed. Wellington repeated, his eyebrows rising with the kind of polite interest that experienced executives used when they encountered information that contradicted their understanding of established facts. "Ms. Frost, are you suggesting that Ms. Williams' reservation was not legitimate?" "Well, no, not exactly." Melissa stammered, suddenly aware that her casual dismissal of Zara's status might have been based on assumptions rather than verified information. Her documentation appeared to be in order, but there was some confusion about seating arrangements, and we had to make adjustments to accommodate our valued frequent flyers. Captain Davidson, who had been monitoring the conversation from a respectful distance, stepped forward with the kind of professional authority that he typically used to manage difficult situations and protect the interests of his crew. "I'm Captain Pierce Davidson, aircraft commander for this flight. If there are concerns about passenger documentation or seating irregularities, I can provide you with our flight manifest and crew reports." "Thank you, Captain Davidson," Wellington said, accepting the offer with the courtesy of someone who understood the value of thorough documentation. "But first, I think it would be appropriate for us to speak directly with Ms. Williams about her experience during this flight." As the group moved toward the back of the cabin, the other passengers turned to watch with the kind of fascination that people typically reserved for dramatic television programs or courtroom proceedings. The businessman in 3C held up his phone, apparently recording the proceedings, while the young woman in 6A leaned forward to get a better view of what was clearly becoming a significant confrontation. Wellington stopped beside row 8, where Zara remained seated with the calm composure that had characterized her behavior throughout the entire ordeal. She looked up from her phone, where she had been reviewing final details of the acquisition documentation that would officially transfer ownership of Meridian Airways to Phoenix Dynamics, and met Wellington's eyes with the kind of direct gaze that suggested perfect understanding between colleagues who had worked together for years. "Ms. Williams," Wellington said, his voice shifting to a tone of respectful deference that was immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with corporate hierarchies and power dynamics. "I apologize for the delay in our arrival. The transition team is in position, and we're ready to proceed with the implementation of Protocol 7 whenever you're prepared." The words hung in the air like a revelation that transformed the entire context of everything that had occurred during the flight. Melissa's face went pale as she began to understand that the passenger she had spent hours harassing and humiliating was apparently someone of sufficient importance to warrant a coordinated response from what appeared to be a team of high-level executives and legal professionals. Protocol 7. Captain Davidson repeated, his voice carrying a note of confusion and growing concern as he tried to understand what kind of situation he had unknowingly become involved in. "I'm not familiar with that designation. Is this some kind of federal investigation?" Zara stood up slowly, gathering her personal belongings with the unhurried precision of someone who was finally ready to reveal information that had been carefully concealed throughout the entire journey. She stepped into the aisle, her slight frame somehow commanding the attention of everyone in the cabin, and looked directly at Captain Davidson with an expression that was both calm and utterly transformative. "Captain Davidson," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had characterized her responses to harassment and discrimination throughout the flight. "My name is Zara Williams, and I'm the founder and chairwoman of Phoenix Dynamics. As of approximately 4 hours ago, Phoenix Dynamics completed its acquisition of Meridian Airways' parent company for $9.7 billion. The silence that followed her announcement was profound. The kind of quiet that occurs when reality shifts so dramatically that people need time to process information that contradicts everything they thought they understood about their situation. Melissa's mouth opened and closed without sound, while Captain Davidson's face went through a series of expressions that reflected his struggle to reconcile the woman he had threatened to place on a no-fly list with someone who apparently now owned the entire airline. Which means Zara continued, her voice still quiet but carrying clearly through the cabin where every passenger was now listening with rapt attention, that as of this moment every person working on this aircraft is technically my employee, including you, Captain Davidson, and you, Ms. Frost. Ashton Blackwood, who had been watching the proceedings with growing alarm as he began to understand that the situation was far more complex than a routine customs inspection, finally found his voice. "That's impossible," he declared, his tone carrying the desperate conviction of someone whose worldview was crumbling in real time. "There's no way that someone like her could own an airline. This has to be some kind of mistake or fraud." Zara turned her attention to Ashton, meeting his gaze with the kind of direct assessment that she had learned to use in boardrooms filled with men who had initially dismissed her before learning to fear the power she represented. "Mr. Blackwood, isn't it?" she said, her voice carrying a note of polite interest that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. "I believe you spent considerable time during this flight explaining to various crew members why you deserved my seat more than I did." The use of the possessive pronoun, my seat, carried implications that were beginning to dawn on everyone present. If Zara Williams truly owned Meridian Airways, then every seat on every aircraft was literally her seat, and Ashton's sense of entitlement had led him to demand that the actual owner of the airline give up her property to accommodate his preferences. Dr. Chen, Zara said, turning to the lawyer who had been documenting every word of the conversation, "I believe we have sufficient evidence to proceed with the immediate implementation of the personnel and policy changes we discussed. Please coordinate with Mr. Wellington to ensure that all affected employees receive proper notification of their new employment status." The conference room in Hangar 7 at Heathrow Airport was a study in corporate efficiency and barely concealed intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a panoramic view of the aircraft maintenance facility below, where teams of engineers worked on massive jet engines with the precision of surgeons and the focus of people who understood that any mistake could cost lives. The room itself was equipped with the latest video conferencing technology, secure communication systems, and the kind of polished conference table that suggested serious decisions were made here on a regular basis. Zara sat at the head of the table, still wearing her worn jeans and hoodie, though the casual clothing now seemed like a deliberate choice, rather than evidence of economic limitation. To her right sat James Wellington, his tablet open to files containing detailed personnel records, financial projections, and legal documentation. To her left, Dr. Sarah Chen arranged a series of folders with the methodical precision that had made her legendary among corporate lawyers who specialized in complex acquisitions and employment litigation. Across the table sat the accused, though none of them had yet understood that they were about to face judgment for actions that they had considered routine aspects of their professional responsibilities. Captain Pierce Davidson occupied the chair closest to the door, his uniform still crisp, but his expression reflecting growing awareness that his authority over the situation had evaporated the moment Zara revealed her identity. Melissa Frost sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she tried to process the transformation of a passenger she had harassed into the owner of the company that employed her. Ashton Blackwood had been provided with a seat at the far end of the table, his expensive clothing and confident bearing now seeming like costumes worn by an actor who had forgotten his lines. His lawyer, hastily summoned from central London, sat beside him taking notes and occasionally whispering advice that Ashton appeared to be ignoring in favor of his own increasingly desperate attempts to salvage a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. Before we begin, Dr. Chen announced, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had conducted hundreds of similar proceedings throughout her career. I want to ensure that everyone understands the legal framework within which these proceedings are taking place. Phoenix Dynamics completed its acquisition of Meridian Airways at approximately 2:30 p.m. London time during the flight that brought us all together today. This means that all employment relationships, policies, and procedures are now subject to review and potential modification under the authority of the new ownership structure. The formal language was designed to provide legal clarity while avoiding the kind of inflammatory rhetoric that might complicate future court proceedings. But everyone in the room understood that they were about to face consequences for actions that had seemed perfectly acceptable when they believed they were dealing with a powerless passenger, rather than the person who now controlled their professional futures. Ms. Williams, Doctor. Chen continued consulting her notes with the precision of someone who had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Would you please describe for the record your experience during Flight 847 from Los Angeles to London, beginning with your interactions with ground staff at LAX? Zara's testimony was delivered in the same calm, measured tone that had characterized her responses to harassment throughout the journey, but the accumulation of incidents created a devastating portrait of institutional bias and casual cruelty. She described Brittany Carlisle's immediate assumption that her boarding pass was fraudulent, Wade Morrison's interrogation about how she had gained access to premium services, and the systematic pattern of differential treatment that had characterized every aspect of her travel experience. When I was forced to move from seat 1A to seat 8. Zara continued, her voice never rising but carrying clearly through the silent conference room. Captain Davidson justified this action by claiming operational necessity. I would like him to explain what specific operational requirements made it necessary for me to give up my assigned seat to accommodate Mr. Blackwood's personal preferences. Captain Davidson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face flushing as he realized that his explanation from the aircraft would not withstand scrutiny in a formal setting where his words would be recorded and potentially used in legal proceedings. Ms. Williams, I made a judgment call based on my assessment of the situation and the need to maintain order in the cabin. Mr. Blackwood is a valued, frequent flyer, and I believed that accommodating his request would prevent further disruption to the flight. A judgment call. Zara repeated her tone, suggesting polite interest rather than accusation. Based on what criteria did you determine that Mr. Blackwood's preferences should take priority over my confirmed reservation? The question hung in the air as Captain Davidson struggled to articulate reasoning that hadn't seemed necessary to justify when he was confident that he would never be called to account for his actions. The truth was that he had made his decision based on assumptions about passenger hierarchy that were rooted in appearance, demeanor, and unconscious bias, but admitting this would effectively end his career and potentially expose him to legal liability. I considered multiple factors, Captain Davidson said, finally his voice lacking the confidence that had characterized his commands aboard the aircraft. Mr. Blackwood's long history with the airline, his status as a frequent flyer, and the importance of maintaining positive relationships with valued customers. And what consideration did you give to my status as a Chairman's Circle member and the legitimacy of my reservation? Zara asked, though both she and Captain Davidson knew that he had given no such consideration whatsoever. Your status was unclear at the time. Captain Davidson admitted, his words coming slowly as he realized that every sentence was creating evidence that could be used against him in future proceedings. There seemed to be some irregularities that needed to be resolved. Dr. Chen consulted her tablet and pulled up a document that she projected onto the conference room's main screen. Captain Davidson. This is the passenger manifest for Flight 847, showing Ms. Williams's reservation details, payment information, and confirmation codes. All of this information was available to you at the time you made your decision. Can you explain what irregularities you observed in this documentation? The manifest was clearly legitimate, containing all the proper codes and confirmations that would have verified Zara's status if Captain Davidson had bothered to check them, rather than making assumptions based on her appearance. His failure to follow proper verification procedures was now documented. Evidence of negligence and possible discrimination that could be used to justify his termination and potentially support civil rights litigation. I should have checked more thoroughly. Captain Davidson conceded, his voice barely above a whisper, as he realized that his career was effectively over and that his pension might be subject to review if Phoenix Dynamics decided to pursue legal action for civil rights violations. Mrs. Frost, Zara said, turning her attention to the flight attendant who had orchestrated much of the harassment she had endured during the flight. I'd like you to explain your decision to serve me economy-class amenities while providing premium service to other first-class passengers. Melissa's face was pale as she realized that her actions were about to be scrutinized in detail by the person who now controlled her employment and potentially her entire future in the airline industry. Ms. Williams, I sincerely apologize for any service issues you may have experienced. Sometimes during flight service, we encounter supply limitations or operational constraints that affect our ability to provide uniform service levels. Supply limitations? Zara repeated, her voice carrying a note of polite skepticism. Ms. Frost, are you claiming that Flight 847 did not carry sufficient Dom Perignon champagne to serve all first-class passengers? The question was a trap that Melissa had walked into through her own dishonesty, because the flight manifest and catering records would show exactly what supplies had been loaded onto the aircraft and how they had been distributed during service. Her claim of supply limitations could be easily disproven with documentation that was already in Phoenix Dynamics' possession. There may have been adequate supplies, Melissa admitted, her voice growing smaller, as she realized that her lies were being methodically dismantled by someone who had apparently been documenting every aspect of her behavior throughout the flight. And the incident involving my laptop computer. Zara continued, her calm tone never changing despite the increasing severity of the accusations she was presenting. You claimed that clear air turbulence had caused a water spill that damaged my equipment. Do you maintain that explanation? Dr. Chen projected the flight data recorder information onto the screen, showing a completely smooth flight profile, with no indication of any turbulence that could have caused liquid to spill from properly secured containers. The data directly contradicted Melissa's explanation and provided clear evidence that the damage to Zara's laptop had been deliberate rather than accidental. I may have been mistaken about the turbulence, Melissa whispered, her voice barely audible, as she realized that she was confessing to deliberate destruction of passenger property in front of lawyers who were recording every word for potential criminal prosecution. The systematic dismantling of each excuse and justification continued for nearly 2 hours, creating a comprehensive record of discrimination, harassment, and deliberate mistreatment that would support both employment terminations and potential civil rights litigation. By the time Dr. Chen closed her final folder, everyone in the conference room understood that they had participated in actions that were not just morally wrong but potentially illegal under federal civil rights statutes. Mr. Blackwood Zara said, finally turning to the venture capitalist who had been sitting in increasingly uncomfortable silence as he watched his fellow travelers face the consequences of their actions. "I believe you have something you'd like to say about bathroom cleaners and people who don't belong in first class?" The silence in the conference room was broken only by the distant hum of jet engines and the soft clicking of Dr. Chen's keyboard as she prepared to document the formal consequences of actions that had seemed perfectly acceptable to their perpetrators just hours earlier. The late afternoon London light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished conference table, where futures were about to be decided with the finality of a judge's gavel. Based on the evidence presented and the admissions made during this proceeding, Dr. Chen announced, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had made her one of the most feared employment lawyers in Silicon Valley. Phoenix Dynamics has reached determinations regarding the employment status of several Meridian Airways personnel involved in the discriminatory treatment of Ms. Williams during Flight 847. James Wellington opened his tablet to a document that had been prepared during the proceedings, its contents reflecting hours of legal research and corporate policy review that had been conducted while the testimonies were being recorded. The efficiency of the response demonstrated the level of preparation and resources that Phoenix Dynamics had brought to bear on what others might have considered a simple customer service dispute. Ms. Melissa Frost Wellington announced, his tone carrying the formal gravity of corporate pronouncements that would be preserved in personnel files and legal documents for years to come. "Your employment with Meridian Airways is terminated effective immediately for gross misconduct, discrimination based on race and perceived economic status, deliberate destruction of passenger property, and providing false statements to corporate investigators." Melissa's face crumpled as the reality of her situation finally penetrated the denial that had sustained her throughout the proceeding. 20 years of seniority pension contributions and professional relationships had been destroyed by a few hours of behavior that she had justified as protecting the airline's premium service standards from passengers who didn't deserve them. Furthermore, Dr. Chen added consulting her legal notes with the precision of someone who had anticipated every possible challenge to their actions. "You will be placed on the industry-wide employment restriction list maintained by the Aviation Personnel Security Consortium, which means that you will not be eligible for employment with any major airline airport authority or related service provider in the future." The industry blacklist was a career death sentence that extended far beyond Meridian Airways to encompass virtually every opportunity for employment in commercial aviation. Melissa would be forced to rebuild her professional life in an entirely different field, carrying the permanent mark of termination for discrimination that would follow her through background checks and employment verifications for the rest of her working life. The deliberate destruction of passenger property. Dr. Chen continued, has been reported to the Metropolitan Police for potential criminal prosecution under the Criminal Damage Act. "You should expect to be contacted by law enforcement regarding possible charges." Captain Pierce Davidson had been watching Melissa's destruction with growing horror as he realized that his own situation was likely to be even worse, given his position of authority and his role in authorizing the discriminatory treatment that had characterized the flight. When Wellington turned his attention to the senior pilot, Davidson's shoulders seemed to collapse under the weight of consequences that he had never imagined when he made his casual decision to override Zara's legitimate reservation. Captain Davidson Wellington said, his voice carrying the formal tone of corporate proceedings that would be cited in legal documents and employment hearings, "Your actions represent not only discrimination and abuse of authority, but also violations of federal aviation regulations regarding passenger treatment and aircraft operations." The mention of federal aviation violations elevated the situation beyond simple employment termination into the realm of regulatory action that could affect Davidson's pilot's license and his ability to work in aviation anywhere in the world. The Federal Aviation Administration took violations of passenger treatment regulations seriously, and discriminatory actions by flight crews could trigger investigations that extended far beyond corporate employment decisions. Your employment as a pilot with Meridian Airways is terminated immediately for cause. Wellington continued reading from the prepared statement with the efficiency of someone who had delivered similar pronouncements many times throughout his career. Your termination for discriminatory conduct will be reported to the FAA, the Civil Aviation Authority, and the International Civil Aviation Organization as required under aviation safety reporting protocols. The cascade of regulatory notifications would effectively end Davidson's flying career, not just with Meridian Airways, but with any airline operating under international aviation agreements. Discrimination against passengers was considered a safety issue because it demonstrated impaired judgment and potential inability to make decisions based on objective criteria rather than personal bias. Additionally, Dr. Chen added, "Your pension benefits are subject to review under the employment misconduct provisions of your contract, and any final determination will depend on the outcome of ongoing federal investigations into civil rights violations." The threat to his pension represented the final destruction of Davidson's financial security, after 25 years of service, reducing him from a senior pilot with substantial retirement savings to someone who would need to find entirely new employment in his 50s while carrying the permanent mark of termination for discrimination. Wade Morrison and Brittany Carlisle, who had participated in the proceedings via secure video link from Los Angeles, watched their colleagues' destruction with growing awareness that their own futures were equally bleak. The ground crew's role in initiating the discriminatory treatment had been thoroughly documented, and their supervisory responsibilities made them equally culpable for the systematic harassment that had followed. Mr. Morrison and Ms. Carlisle Wellington announced turning his attention to the video screen where two pale faces reflected the fluorescent lighting of the LAX break room, where they had been confined since the investigation began. Your employment with Meridian Airways is terminated for discrimination, passenger harassment, and failure to follow established verification procedures. The employment terminations were expected, but the additional consequences reflected the comprehensive nature of Phoenix Dynamics' response to institutional discrimination. Both would be placed on industry blacklists reported to federal authorities for civil rights violations and potentially subject to criminal prosecution if law enforcement agencies decided that their actions warranted legal action beyond employment consequences. Mr. Ashton Blackwood Zara said, finally her voice carrying a note of personal satisfaction as she addressed the man whose sense of entitlement had triggered the entire sequence of events, represents a somewhat different situation, since he was a passenger rather than an employee. Ashton had been consulting frantically with his lawyer throughout the proceedings, searching for legal strategies that might protect him from the consequences of behavior that he was beginning to understand could affect his business relationships and professional reputation. The documentation of his statements and actions during the flight could be used in civil litigation and potentially shared with business partners who might reconsider their relationships with someone whose character had been so thoroughly exposed. However, Dr. Chen added opening a new folder that contained the results of a financial investigation that had been conducted while the employee terminations were being processed. Our due diligence review of Mr. Blackwood's business operations has revealed several irregularities that affect his relationship with Phoenix Dynamics and its subsidiaries. The investigation into Ashton's finances had been triggered by standard acquisition procedures that required reviewing the business relationships of all parties involved in the transition, but it had uncovered evidence of fraudulent expense reporting and potential tax evasion that could support both civil and criminal prosecution. Mr. Blackwood has been systematically billing personal travel expenses to his investment fund while claiming business deductions for the same expenditures. Dr. Chen continued projecting financial records that painted a clear picture of deliberate fraud spanning several years. This represents both securities fraud and tax evasion that will be reported to the appropriate federal authorities. The financial crimes were far more serious than the discriminatory behavior that had brought Ashton to Phoenix Dynamics' attention, carrying potential prison sentences and the complete destruction of his investment business. His sense of entitlement had not only exposed his character, but it also triggered an investigation that revealed criminal behavior that might otherwise have continued undetected for years. Furthermore, Zara added her voice, carrying a note of personal satisfaction. Mr. Blackwood is permanently banned from all Phoenix Dynamics properties and subsidiaries, which now includes Meridian Airways and its partner airlines. Any attempt to book travel on our services will result in automatic rejection and potential trespass charges. The lifetime travel ban was a fitting consequence for someone whose sense of superiority had been based on his access to premium airline services and his ability to displace other passengers through perceived status and influence. He would be forced to find alternative transportation for business and personal travel, carrying the permanent mark of his behavior wherever his professional responsibilities required him to go. The transformation of Meridian Airways began before the last employee termination letters had been delivered, reflecting Phoenix Dynamics' understanding that meaningful change required immediate action rather than gradual policy adjustments that might be undermined by entrenched organizational culture. Within hours of the conclusion of the disciplinary proceedings, new policies were being implemented across the airline's global operations, supported by comprehensive training programs and monitoring systems designed to prevent future instances of discrimination and harassment. James Wellington convened emergency meetings with regional managers across North America, Europe, and Asia, delivering clear expectations about passenger treatment standards that would be enforced through both technological monitoring and financial incentives tied to performance evaluations. The message was unambiguous. Discrimination of any kind would result in immediate termination, industry blacklisting, and potential criminal prosecution regardless of the employee's seniority or previous performance record. Effective immediately, Wellington announced during a company-wide video conference that reached every Meridian Airways facility simultaneously. All passenger interactions will be recorded through enhanced audio and video monitoring systems that will provide real-time feedback on service quality and bias detection. Employees whose interactions consistently reflect discriminatory behavior will be flagged for immediate intervention and potential termination. The technological monitoring represented a significant investment in artificial intelligence systems that could analyze speech patterns, facial expressions, and behavioral indicators to identify discriminatory treatment before it escalated into the kind of systematic harassment that Zara had experienced during Flight 847. The AI systems had been developed by Phoenix Dynamics for use in customer service operations across multiple industries, and their implementation at Meridian Airways would serve as a pilot program for broader applications in transportation and hospitality services. Dr. Chen worked with human resources directors to implement new hiring protocols that included comprehensive bias testing, cultural sensitivity training, and performance standards that explicitly measured employees' ability to provide equitable service regardless of passengers' appearance, perceived economic status, or demographic characteristics. The new standards were designed to identify and eliminate candidates whose attitudes and behaviors might contribute to discriminatory treatment of customers. "We're not just changing policies, Doctor," Chen explained during a training session for senior managers. "We're changing the fundamental culture of this organization from one that rewards discrimination to one that makes discrimination impossible through systematic prevention and immediate consequences." The cultural transformation extended to promotion and advancement opportunities with new leadership tracks specifically designed to elevate employees who had demonstrated exceptional commitment to equitable treatment of all passengers. Several crew members who had been documented providing support to passengers facing discrimination were offered accelerated promotion opportunities and leadership training that would position them for senior roles within the restructured organization. Among those receiving immediate recognition was the elderly businessman from Seat 3C who had documented the discriminatory treatment during Flight 847 and provided testimony that supported the investigation. Marcus Johnson, a retired civil rights lawyer who had spent decades fighting institutional discrimination, was offered a consulting contract with Phoenix Dynamics to help develop training programs for other companies facing similar challenges. What I witnessed on that flight, Johnson said during his first consulting meeting, was not the result of individual bad actors, but of a system that had been designed to sort people into categories based on assumptions about who deserved dignity and who could be safely dismissed. Real change requires dismantling those systems and replacing them with structures that make discrimination operationally impossible. The young woman from Seat 6A, whose willingness to speak out against the harassment she witnessed had provided crucial support to Zara during the flight, was invited to join Phoenix Dynamics' newly established Passenger Advocacy Board. Sarah Martinez, a graduate student in social justice who had risked social discomfort to challenge the crew's behavior, would help develop policies that encouraged other passengers to report discriminatory treatment and protected them from retaliation for speaking out against injustice. Bystander intervention. Martinez explained during her first board meeting is crucial for preventing discrimination from becoming normalized. Passengers who witness harassment need to know that their voices will be heard and that they won't face negative consequences for doing the right thing. The financial impact of the transformation was significant, but manageable for an organization with Phoenix Dynamics resources and long-term strategic vision. The cost of implementing new monitoring systems, training programs, and performance incentives was offset by improved customer satisfaction, reduced liability exposure, and enhanced reputation among travelers who had historically faced discrimination when using commercial aviation services. Industry analysts noted that Phoenix Dynamics' approach to addressing institutional discrimination could serve as a model for other companies facing similar challenges, particularly in service industries where unconscious bias could affect customer experiences and corporate reputation. The comprehensive nature of the response demonstrated that meaningful change was possible when organizations committed sufficient resources and maintained consistent enforcement of new standards. This isn't corporate public relations, noted Dr. Angela Roberts, a professor of organizational behavior at Harvard Business School, who had studied Phoenix Dynamics' approach. This is a fundamental restructuring of how a company defines success, measures performance, and allocates resources to ensure that their values are reflected in every customer interaction. The ripple effects of Meridian Airways' transformation began appearing throughout the airline industry as competitors scrambled to review their own policies and training programs to avoid the kind of public relations disaster that had befallen the previous management. Other airlines implemented new discrimination reporting systems, expanded bias training requirements, and established passenger advocacy programs that reflected growing awareness of the financial and legal risks associated with discriminatory treatment of customers. Federal regulators took note of Phoenix Dynamics' comprehensive approach and began developing new guidelines for passenger treatment that could be applied across the transportation industry. The Department of Transportation announced plans to study the effectiveness of technological monitoring systems for preventing discrimination and to consider mandating similar programs for all airlines receiving federal subsidies or operating under government contracts. The Williams case, as it became known in legal and business circles, established new precedents for both civil rights litigation and corporate responsibility for addressing institutional bias. The speed and comprehensiveness of Phoenix Dynamics' response demonstrated that meaningful change was possible when organizations prioritized justice over profit protection and committed resources to systematic rather than cosmetic reforms. 6 months after Flight 847 landed at Heathrow Airport, Zara Williams stood in her corner office on the 42nd floor of Phoenix Dynamics' headquarters in downtown Los Angeles. looking out over a city where millions of people navigated daily challenges that included both subtle and overt discrimination based on appearance assumptions and inherited advantages that had nothing to do with character or worth. The office was decorated with artifacts that reflected her journey from a working-class neighborhood in South Central to the executive suites of Silicon Valley, including a framed photograph of her grandmother who had endured humiliation at this same airport 3 decades earlier, but had lived long enough to see her granddaughter transform that painful experience into a platform for systematic change. On her desk sat a handwritten letter from Marcus Johnson, the retired civil rights lawyer who had documented the discrimination during Flight 847 and had become a crucial ally in implementing reforms throughout the transportation industry. His consultancy work with Phoenix Dynamics had expanded to include partnerships with hotel chains, retail companies, and financial services organizations that were seeking to address their own patterns of institutional bias. Your grandmother would be proud, the letter read, not just of your success, but of your understanding that success without purpose is just accumulation. You've transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a movement for institutional justice, and that legacy will outlast any individual achievement or corporate acquisition. The transformation of Meridian Airways had exceeded every expectation for both financial performance and cultural change, with customer satisfaction ratings reaching industry-leading levels and employee retention improving dramatically as workers responded to clear expectations and fair treatment regardless of their own backgrounds or the backgrounds of passengers they served. But the most meaningful validation had come from passengers who shared their own stories of travel experiences that had been fundamentally different from what they had encountered in the past. Letters arrived daily from travelers who described being treated with dignity and respect regardless of their appearance, age, disability status, or perceived economic circumstances. One letter that Zara kept framed on her credenza came from a young black girl named Amara, who had flown alone for the first time to visit her father in London. The flight attendant made sure I felt safe and welcome, Amara had written in careful cursive handwriting. She said that every passenger was important and that the airplane belonged to all of us. I want to work for your company when I grow up, so I can make other kids feel the way you made me feel. The industry-wide changes that had followed Phoenix Dynamics' acquisition of Meridian Airways represented the kind of systematic transformation that civil rights advocates had been seeking for decades. Federal legislation inspired by the Williams case had established new standards for passenger treatment across all forms of commercial transportation, with enforcement mechanisms that included both financial penalties and criminal prosecution for discriminatory behavior. Dr. Sarah Chen had been appointed to a federal advisory committee on transportation equity, where she worked with legislators and regulators to develop policies that would prevent the kind of institutional discrimination that had characterized commercial aviation for generations. Her legal expertise and practical experience implementing change at Meridian Airways made her uniquely qualified to design enforcement mechanisms that could survive legal challenges and political pressures. The most important lesson from the Williams case, Dr. Chen testified before a congressional subcommittee, is that discrimination is not the result of individual prejudice alone, but of systems that reward bias and protect people who engage in discriminatory behavior. Real change requires dismantling those protective systems and replacing them with structures that make discrimination both detectable and costly. James Wellington had been promoted to Chief Executive Officer of the newly restructured airline, which had been renamed Phoenix Airways to reflect its transformation under new ownership and management. His leadership had been crucial in managing the cultural change process while maintaining operational efficiency and financial performance during a period of comprehensive organizational reform. The success of Phoenix Airways had attracted attention from investors and competitors who were beginning to understand that equitable treatment of customers represented not just a moral imperative, but also a significant competitive advantage in markets where diverse populations controlled increasing amounts of consumer spending power, but perhaps the most satisfying transformation had been personal rather than institutional. Ashton Blackwood, whose sense of entitlement had triggered the entire sequence of events, had been convicted of securities fraud and tax evasion, receiving a prison sentence that would provide him with several years to reflect on the relationship between privilege and responsibility. Melissa Frost, the former flight attendant whose cruelty had been so thoroughly documented, had eventually found employment as a customer service representative for a nonprofit organization that provided support services to formerly incarcerated individuals. Her own experience with unemployment discrimination had given her unexpected empathy for people facing systematic barriers to opportunity, and she had become an advocate for second chances and redemption through genuine change, rather than superficial apologies. Captain Pierce Davidson had used his aviation experience to become a flight instructor at a community college where he worked with students from diverse backgrounds who were seeking careers in commercial aviation. His own experience with the consequences of bias had made him uniquely qualified to prepare the next generation of pilots to treat all passengers with the dignity and respect that should be fundamental to professional service. "I teach my students," Davidson said during a training seminar, "that every passenger who steps onto an aircraft deserves to be treated like the most important person in the world, regardless of what seat they're sitting in or how much money they paid for their ticket." That's not just good customer service, it's basic human decency. The comprehensive nature of the changes that had followed Flight 847 demonstrated that meaningful progress was possible when organizations committed resources to systematic reform rather than cosmetic adjustments designed to avoid negative publicity. The Williams case had become a model for addressing institutional discrimination across multiple industries, with business schools teaching case studies based on Phoenix Dynamics' approach to identifying and eliminating bias in customer service operations. Zara had been invited to speak at universities' corporate conferences and civil rights organizations about the relationship between economic power and social justice, sharing her understanding that true change required both the resources to implement comprehensive reforms and the commitment to maintain those standards even when they were inconvenient or expensive. "Power without compassion becomes tyranny," she told audiences at these speaking engagements. "But compassion without power remains just good intentions. The goal is to use whatever influence you have to create systems that protect dignity for everyone, not just for people who look like you or share your advantages." As she prepared to leave her office that evening, Zara received a text message from her assistant informing her that a documentary about the Williams case had been completed and would be premiering at the Sundance Film Festival the following month. The film, titled Seat 1A, had been produced with her cooperation and would donate its proceeds to organizations working to address transportation discrimination and promote equitable access to travel for underserved communities. The documentary would ensure that the lessons of Flight 847 reached audiences far beyond the business and legal communities that had followed the case closely, potentially inspiring other individuals to recognize their own power to challenge systems of discrimination and work toward the kind of institutional change that could prevent future passengers from experiencing the humiliation that had motivated Zara's comprehensive response. Standing at her office window as the Los Angeles sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought her from Seat 8D on a transatlantic flight to a position where she could influence systems that affected millions of travelers around the world. The personal satisfaction was significant, but the real victory was the knowledge that other passengers would never again be forced to endure the kind of systematic harassment that had characterized her own travel experience. Tomorrow she would board another flight, this time on Phoenix Airways, where she would be treated with dignity not because of her wealth or ownership of the airline, but because dignity had become the standard that every passenger could expect regardless of their appearance, background, or assumptions about their place in the world. That transformation from exception to expectation represented the kind of systematic change that could outlast any individual achievement and create lasting progress toward a more equitable society where power was used to protect the vulnerable rather than to reinforce existing hierarchies of privilege and exclusion. 2 years after Flight 847, Phoenix Airways led the industry in customer satisfaction across all demographic categories, with comprehensive bias monitoring systems that had been adopted by transportation companies worldwide. Federal legislation inspired by the Williams case had established new civil rights protections for travelers, with enforcement mechanisms that made discrimination both detectable and costly for companies that failed to maintain equitable treatment standards. Ashton Blackwood completed his prison sentence and became a community advocate for financial literacy, using his own experience with the consequences of privilege and entitlement to help formerly incarcerated individuals avoid the mistakes that had destroyed his previous life. His transformation from symbol of corporate arrogance to genuine reformer demonstrated that accountability could lead to redemption when coupled with authentic commitment to change. The story of Seat 1A became required reading in business ethics courses and civil rights seminars, ensuring that future generations would understand both the persistent nature of institutional discrimination and the possibility of comprehensive reform when organizations committed resources to systematic change rather than superficial adjustments designed to avoid negative publicity. Zara's words echoed in corporate boardrooms and university classrooms around the world. Judge your organization not by how you treat the people who can help you, but by how you treat the people you think can't hurt you. Someone is always watching, and dignity doesn't require a boarding pass. It's the foundation of every genuine human interaction. If this story of justice and transformation moved you, please hit the like button to help us reach more people who need to hear this message. Share your thoughts in the comments about how small acts of courage can create lasting change, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that injustice is just the way the world works.